Hi, welcome back to He's Got a Big Head. Haha, just kidding. This video series is called Conversations That Don't Help with Making Friends or Trivia. Today's topic of conversation is going to be about the extinction of the Beothuk people. Now, the Beothuk people were a group of indigenous people that lived on the island of Newfoundland, and they officially went extinct in 1829. So I'm going to talk about that whole story. So the island of Newfoundland was officially discovered in 1497 during the Age of Discovery. The Vikings had been there in the year 1000 before, but they weren't really liking it, so they took off pretty much right away. So there's this 500-year period where an indigenous group sort of had free reign of the land on Newfoundland. And they lived around the outside on the beach of Newfoundland. Seasonally, they were eating birds and salmons and mooses and caribous and all of that sort of thing. And they were having a good time until the Europeans showed up around 1500 when the migratory fishing industry began. So everyone in Europe is coming over because there's all kinds of fish in Newfoundland. They're having a great time. But during that period in time, it was all seasonal. It was migratory fishing. So people would come in during the summers or the springs, get all their fishes. They'd go back to Europe, have a kiki. It was lovely. And at this point in time, the Beothuk were able to sort of tolerate the encroachment of the colonists just because it was only seasonal. So they would just retreat from the beach and go into the woods when the Europeans came. However, over the course of about 200 years, progressively migratory businesses, policies, all that sort of thing became permanent. So now there's permanent warfare, permanent colonies, permanent exploitation of resources. All of this sort of thing is happening full time now on the island. So the Beothuk can't really come back out of the woods. So their area just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. In addition to this, other indigenous groups that lived on the mainland had now sort of mastered long-distance sea travel, so they're starting to colonize the island as well, and the Beothuk people are basically just screwed. So in 1786, which is 280 years after the island was first discovered, the Beothuk people are now in crisis, and they have been avoiding European trade conversation. They'd been avoiding the Europeans basically the entire time. They would run at the sight of anyone sort of showing up, so there was no trade, there was no knowledge of their culture, nothing like that. So in 1786, this governor of Newfoundland, Palliser, I think his name was, Hugh Palliser, that was his name. So he decides to make this law because he's like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that we were doing this to these people, whatever. And he hires this guy, John Cartwright, to go out and find the Beothuks and sort of put his guilt at ease for basically destroying their homeland and wiping their people out. So John Cartwright gets these people together and he's like, we're going to go find them. So he goes, at the start of his trip, he meets this guy named Tom June, who was a Beothuk boy who was captured when he was quite young, 10 years before the Cartwright showed up. And he drew Cartwright this impromptu map, sort of explained to Cartwright how to get to the Beothuk Mecca, their big stronghold, the city. And so Cartwright sets out. He goes out with 14 men, just all kinds of stuff, like bread and doodads and trinkets and muskets, even though the Beothuks hated guns. They wanted nothing to do with guns or alcohol or Jesus or any of that stuff. So anyways, he has all this stuff, goes out to find them with this map that Tom June had made for him. Doesn't come in contact with any of the Beothuk. He's pissed. By the end of his trip, it took about a week to get there, 10 days to get to this camp. Out of 14 men, only 5 made it to the end. They didn't meet any Beothuks on the way. However, the state of their living and their very, very small numbers that were left of them was noted by Cartwright, who wrote this just absolutely scathing letter to the British government, to the governor, saying that what they were doing to these people was wrong, that they destroyed their habitat, that they'd driven these people to extinction, that action is required now, or that we're going to live to regret this, blah, 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 blah. And nobody cared, which was quite sad. This was really sort of the breaking point in their extinction event. So 20 to 30 years later, nothing has been done. There's a huge anti-Native sentiment that's happening sort of in the press, especially since all of the indigenous people of that whole area, like on Labrador, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, that whole thing. They're all sort of seen as like one group of people. It's very that. So nobody really cared about them going extinct at this point. So in 1819, this guy, John Peyton Sr., owns this fishing empire in Newfoundland, salmon fisheries, and he's this target of constant attack by the Beothuk, who at this point probably are less than 30 people left on the island, and they are sort of staging these strategic attacks to go and do like industrial espionage and all that sort of thing. So John Peyton Sr. had been getting attacked over and over and over again, but he was sort of putting up with it because he felt bad. But then this one night, he has this boat that he's set up for this boys' weekend out, where they're gonna set out at daybreak and go on this fishing adventure. So he's got this huge boat loaded up with all these supplies, blah 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 blah. And he goes out to have a smoke, goes back in, and after he has his smoke, there was a group of people group of Beothuks under the wharf who came out, cut the boat loose, and John Peyton Sr. wakes up, he's pissed. So he goes and tells the governor, and he said, look, I'm going to find my boat. I'm going to capture one of them. Enough is enough. And the governor says, whatever, have at her. So Peyton Sr. takes Peyton Jr. and 10 other guys, and they go out to go find his boat, which they find about a mile away. It's not that far. Everything's gone from the boat except for the guns, which have been destroyed and left in the river next to them, which I thought was pretty fierce. And they follow this map that Cartwright had drawn 30 years before, get all the way into the heart of the Beothuk territory, and they actually find the last group of Beothuks that are there. There's about 30 of them. They start running. Peyton Jr. drops everything, just hauls ass, finally catches this woman who was very sick. She probably already had tuberculosis at this point in time, had just given birth to a baby. She kind of tosses her baby off and says, take me, take me, take me. So they do take her. Unfortunately, her husband sort of runs back to rescue her, and he is stabbed and shot in the altercation. The woman's name was Demasduit, and she was taken back by Peyton Jr. to live with him. This attracted the attention of another explorer named David Buchanan, who I believe was Scottish. So he shows up in Newfoundland, and he immediately wants to meet Demasduit. He wants to take her back to her people. He wants to be the hero of the story that sort of fixes it all, rights all the wrongs. Demasduit says, hell to the no, I'm not going back into the woods. Y'all shot my husband. There's none of us left. We're starving. They're going to kill me if I go back anyway, as sort of this rite of passage. So she lives with the Peytons for about a year when she dies of tuberculosis. So she was caught in March. So her name was Mary March, and she perished in June. Buchanan tried very hard to get her to go back. She couldn't. So he actually had her body. He took her body with a bunch of gifts, like half a ton of bread, all kinds of like silver, jewelry, ornaments, that sort of thing. And they bring her body back to the area that she was captured at. They find a gravestone for her late husband and her baby, which died 2 days after she was taken. They laid her to rest there with all of these sort of gifts that wanted to say, we're really sorry for abducting you and murdering your people. So they leave that there, and then they sort of piss off. And at this point, it's sort of assumed that it's all over. It's done. The Beothuk are toast. So a year later, 2 years later, this guy Cormac shows up. He was born in Newfoundland, but he did all of his studying in the university. He did that all in Scotland. He comes back. His name's Cormac. He wants to set up this Beothuk Institute where he takes Cartwright's maps and Buchanan's maps and all these journals, and he wants to go map the interior, get all the Beothuk history, start the archaeology, all of that stuff. And after this Beothuk Institute sets up, Cormac, Buchanan, and Peyton Jr. get word of this Beothuk couple that had shown up sort of out of the woods and were shot as an act of self-defense. It was very weird. So Cormac, Peyton Jr., Buchanan all run to this area where this Beothuk had been shot to take the hunters out to the spot where this murder had happened, where they then found 3 other Beothuk women who were emaciated, sick of tuberculosis, basically on death's doorstep, and these women kind of turn themselves over to the colonists and say, you know what, we're done, we're over it. 2 of the ladies died almost immediately, like within a day. And the last of the Beothuk was Shawnadithit. So Shawnadithit was actually Demasduit's niece, and she was taken back to live with Preston Jr. She lived with Preston Jr. actually for 6 years. And it was said that the family actually loved her. They really loved her. And especially since Demasduit had been taken back to the town, both of these women's stories really turned sort of the tide on how colonists viewed native populations in Newfoundland. It was a very sad awakening for a lot of people there. A lot of people in Newfoundland at this time had felt this, like the weight of this cultural scar of what they had done. And that makes these 2 women very, very important to Canadian history and something that people should be talking about a lot more than they actually do. So Shawnadithit had lived for 6 years with the Paytons. I guess on file she was paid as a maid, but from all accounts she was never really forced to do work or anything of that nature. And right as she started like about to die, Cormac says, you know what, you've got to come to my laboratory and transcribe the records of your people, give us all the information you possibly can. We're probably never going to find another Beothuk again, so now time's up. So they take her. She doesn't want to go. The Paytons don't want her to go, but Cormac is like, you're coming. Governor says you're coming. So she moves to his study, draws him maps, draws about culture, tells him about the religion, all of that stuff. She was there the night that Demasduit was taken. She was there the night that John Payton Sr.'s boat was taken. She knows about their relationships with the French, with the Mi'kmaq, with all these groups. So basically everything that we know about the Beothuk in the Beothuk voice was told or provided by Shawnadithit to Cormac. And unfortunately, shortly after, she died of tuberculosis. And that officially ends the Beothuk people as a civilization. It's said that some Beothuk continue to exist or integrate, or some escaped to Labrador. There are people alive with Beothuk DNA presently, but for all intents and purposes, with her death in 1829, the Beothuk people ceased. So our story concludes in 1836, which is quite a bit later, and David Buchanan shows up at this inquest that the Crown, the Royal Navy, the British, do this inquest into their colonial activities, including Newfoundland, where Buchanan testifies that colonialism is directly responsible for the extinction of the Beothuk people, that if Cartwright had been listened to in 1786, that they could have avoided this, maybe, saved the Beothuk people, but nothing was done. Prejudice persisted, that we should be ashamed of ourselves, and we need to learn from our mistakes. So thank you for that, Buchanan. So that's the story of the Beothuk people. I'm sorry I couldn't get more of the conversation. It's a really, really interesting topic. I encourage everybody to go and look up that story on their own. Super, super interesting. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this conversation with me. And thank you so much. So if you liked this video, this conversation, and you would like to hear more videos like this, then please comment, like, and subscribe. Thank you. Please like and subscribe.